Thank you, Madam President, and I want to thank my colleague from Arizona for
Senator
yielding.
from South Dakota.
I want to thank my colleague from Arizona for yielding time, and I'd say that this Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is a pox on all of us, but shame on us if we don't try and do something here in this legislation to address this issue. And what the McCain, Shelby, Gregg amendment does, Madam President, is a responsible thing. It does allow for a wind down of this conservatorship, but it goes squarely at what I think, as the senator from Arizona has pointed out, most economists argue was a huge contributor to the meltdown that we experienced a couple years ago. This runaway lending and irresponsible lending practices that were involved with the plight that we now see with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, where they have, up until, I think, this last quarter, or if you take the last quarter combined, it's about $145 billion now that the taxpayers are on the hook. And as the senator from Arizona pointed out, last Christmas Eve, the administration lifted the cap. There was a $400 billion cap on the amount of taxpayer assistance that could be provided to these two institutions. But now that cap has been lifted. I mean, imagine the scale and the dimension of what we're talking about here. When we've already got $145 billion of taxpayer exposure, we assume that it could be as much as $400 billion, but just in case, the administration lifts the cap, because it could go well beyond that, which suggests, if history is any indication, that it will go well beyond that. And what this does is says we need to exercise some responsibility with regard to the regulation of all the financial institutions in this country. And what the senator from Connecticut and his bill does with Financial Services Regulation Reform Bill is attempts to get at what contributed in many respects to the meltdown that we experienced a couple of years ago, but it ignores, perhaps, as has been pointed out by the senator from Arizona, one of the biggest contributors to that problem. And that is these two toxic institutions, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Now, the administration has said that they need time to come up with a plan. The side-by-side that's going to be offered by the Democrats is going to be a study. We're going to study this for like 6 months. And I think that their argument is that it would be dangerous to rush the process. I think the contrary is true. I believe it's dangerous, Madam President, to ignore this problem for any longer. We cannot afford to wait so that more taxpayer money can be lost, can be wasted on trying to keep these two entities afloat. Now, as I said before, last week we were informed that Freddie Mac needs an additional $10.6 billion in taxpayer funds due to an $8 billion loss in the first quarter of 2010. Since September of 2008, that brings the taxpayer invoice for Freddie Mac to $61.3 billion. Fannie Mae reported a first quarter loss of more than $13 billion, needing $8.4 billion from the government, putting their bill to the American taxpayer at $83.6 billion. So the grand total of taxpayer loss from these two entities since their takeover in 2008 is a whopping $145 billion. Now, Madam President, the losses racked up by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae exceed the government's losses on AIG, General Motors, and Chrysler. Yet the current legislation here in the Senate is completely silent on these two entities. Madam President, that is outrageous. We cannot continue to funnel unlimited amounts of taxpayer money into Freddie and Fannie and have no plan to end this siphon. In a time when we're faced with crushing debt and out-of-control deficits, we're willing to turn a blind eye to a $145 billion problem, which is going to only magnify over time to the point that last Christmas Eve, the administration lifted the cap of $400 billion, which is what initially was put in place that would limit the amount of taxpayer exposure. But what we're now saying is that may not be enough, and yet we do nothing in this legislation to remedy this problem. Now, obviously, the administration knew there was more bad news ahead when they decided to lift the cap on government assistance on Christmas Eve of last year. The Obama administration decided that the taxpayers could afford unlimited funding for Freddie and Fannie rather than keep a $400 billion cap on assistance in place. And it's frightening that they believe that $400 billion is not going to be enough. And unlimited funding may not be enough. I mean, who knows where this thing ends? And that's why I think it's important right now that we deal with this issue, and the McCain-Shelby-Gregg amendment does it in a responsible way by winding down and providing a timeline. It sets a 30-month date out there by which this conservatorship has to be wound down. Now, if you look at what the current exposure is in terms of Freddie and Fannie, they own or guarantee over 30 million home loans worth about $5.5 trillion, and the CBO estimates that Freddie and Fannie could cost the taxpayers as much as $380 billion through 2020. As I said before, my assumption is that because we lifted the administration lifted the cap on the $400 billion of exposure, the assumption is it's going to go much higher than that. And so I think we have to ask ourselves this fundamental question. And is this the direction that we want to continue heading, or is it time to change course? The time to change course is now, while we are debating a bill that is designed to address the very problems that created the problems that we encountered a couple of years ago. And Freddie and Fannie, Madam President, as the senator from Arizona has said, were at the very heart, the very core of that issue. According to a recent Washington Post article, with the government's conservatorship of Freddie and Fannie, the increase in FHA and VA loans, the government backed nearly 97% of home loans in the first quarter of 2010. 97% of loans are backed by the United States government. Is this where we want to end up? Is this where we want to head? Is this the best course for our housing market? Is this the role the federal government should be taking when it comes to housing in this country? I firmly believe, Madam President, that it is time that we change course. I think there's great value. We all agree that there's great value in home ownership in this country and helping families achieve the American dream of owning their own home. But we have got to bring personal responsibility back into the conversation. We need to go back to a time when families saved up money to make a down payment on a house. They went to their bank, they provided the necessary documentation to prove that they could pay back their loan, and they bought a house that was within their budget. Buying and owning a home should be a goal that people work to achieve, not a government mandate funded by the taxpayers, and that essentially is what we have created. So, Madam President, I believe it's about time to take responsibility for our actions. My constituents in my state who bought houses they could afford and pay their bills on time want to see Congress to start taking some responsibility. And I believe that the McCain-Shelby-Gregg amendment does just that and shows our commitment to getting our fiscal house here in order in Washington, D.C. As I said, it is a sound plan for winding down the government backstop to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. It mandates that conservatorship ends in 30 months or less. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae will have to reduce their portfolios by 10% each year, and if they're not viable enough to exist after the 30 months, they'll be liquidated. If they are a viable company after 30 months, they would only enjoy their federal GSE status for another 3 years. The amendment repeals the affordable housing goals that persuaded the two entities to enter into the subprime loan business in the first place, which I believe was the slippery slope, Madam President, that got us into all the problems and all the troubles that we're facing today. It creates new underwriting requirements on loans purchased by Freddie and Fannie. Freddie and Fannie will have to reduce their mortgage assets by more than 50% within 2 years and increase their capital reserves. It repeals a temporary increase in conforming loan limit, returning it back to $417,000. The two would have to pay state and local taxes, register with the FEC, and pay a fee to the government to repay their debts to the taxpayer. These are all responsible reforms, Madam President, and contrary to the assertions that have been made by the other side, this amendment is the correct way to proceed in dealing with these two giant institutions that have lost their way and are costing the taxpayers literally billions and billions and billions of dollars every quarter that passes that we don't take steps to fix this problem. The amendment would reinstate the $400 billion cap that the administration lifted in December so that taxpayers know for certain that they are not going to be on the hook for unlimited financial support. The amendment establishes a new special inspector general at the GAO to investigate and report to Congress on these two entities. Freddie and Fannie would be included in the federal budget until their conservatorship is ended, which is the fiscally responsible thing to do when we all know they do, in fact, have an impact on our budget and on our debt. Now, I have said, as I said, Madam President, I've heard the arguments the other side of the aisle. I think they are ignoring the clear will of the American people. The American people get this. They know that why we are where we are. They're sick and tired of subsidizing the mistakes of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and we need to put an end to the taxpayer bailout. And I think it's important to the credibility of our economy with the American, and to the credibility, our credibility with American taxpayers, but it's important, the credibility of the markets and to our economy, that they understand that we're serious about solving this problem. And that's why the Gregg McCain-Shelby amendment, McCain-Shelby-Gregg amendment is the correct way to proceed, Madam President. We're going to have a vote on that very soon here, and I hope we won't leave this subject, that we won't dispose of this financial services regulation reform bill without addressing this very important topic. It is to suggest for a minute, as the other side has, that somehow we can do a study, we can put this off for 6 months, and who knows, by the time they complete the study, they'll have to think about the results of that study and formulate a plan, and that'll take another 6 months or a year. And every single month, every single quarter that goes by, we continue to hemorrhage more and more money at the cost of billions and billions of dollars to the American taxpayer. They've had enough, Madam President. We should say we have had enough, and that we're going to bring some discipline. This amendment does that, and I hope that my colleagues will support it. Madam President, I yield the balance of my time.